Okay, welcome everyone. My name is James Orbinski. I'm the principal of Massey College, and it's my pleasure to invite you to participate in Massey Dialogue. And today we are talking about the role of the university, the role of in the modern era. We know that, for example, the very first university, or the form that gave rise to the first university, actually emerged in the medieval era and was known as a studia generalia. And it was originally designed to educate clerks and monks. But the education of clerks and monks, until the emergence of studia generalia, took place in cathedrals and monastic schools. And with the emergence of the studia generalia, it was really the beginning of the introduction of foreign scholars to the education of clergy and monks. And the idea then of opening the mind, opening the experience to the other was really the essence, if you will, of that particular moment. There have been many evolutionary peaks to the emergence of the modern day university, and I'm sure that our panel will talk about that. And here we are now in really the post-Enlightenment period, where the very idea of the university is challenged by substantive realities, both on campus and in broader society. On campus, one of the biggest, but not the only issue, is the issue of protest and the issue of expression, freedom of expression. More broadly, within society, the question of what is the purpose of a university? Is it simply to train people? Is it to educate? And what's the difference between training and education? Is it to support and promote research? What kind of research? Discovery research, implementation research? And what is the role of the university vis-a-vis the broader society? Does it have an obligation to participate in dialogue and debate within broader society? Or is it removed and somehow privileged and protected, not only in its own internal judiciary and authoritative powers, but is it removed from the reality of day-to-day life, both politically, culturally, socially, and economically? And these are really, really important, dominant challenges of our age. The biggest opportunity here in this Massey Dialogue is to listen and to interact with some highly, highly esteemed scholars and thinkers and practitioners who have deep experience with the issues that we're engaging today. I'll leave it to our chair of the panel, Ikran Jama, to actually introduce each of the panelists. But if you don't mind, Ikran, I'll just take a second and introduce you. Ikran is a second-year law school student here at Massey College, and she's a Massey College Junior Fellow, where she's one of our brightest and best, and that is certainly what I'm told, and I'm sure you'll prove it to be true. Ikran has a BA in Criminology and International Relations and African Studies from the University of Toronto. She's also a Rhodes Scholar, has 2 master's degrees from Oxford University, one in Criminology, the other in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies. As she served 2 terms here at the University of Toronto as President of the Arts and Science Student Union, and largely advocating on behalf of some 27,000 students within that Arts and Science Student Union. And she's a recent alumnus on the Dean of Arts and Sciences Advisory Council. And Ikran's research interests very much focus on marginalized youth and marginalized Black communities within a Canadian context, and particularly those marginalized who are or have been refugees or recent immigrants to the country. And with that, and I will just finally say, we are very proud that you were one of our junior fellows, and very much look forward to the dialogue. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Principal Orbinski. I thought that was me. Okay. Thank you so much. That was such a warm introduction and a great introduction into today's conversation. University autonomy has long been a cornerstone of higher education, allowing institutions significant powers of self-governance. However, as political and social pressures evolve, it raises important questions about the future of autonomy in today's changing environment. I'm excited to hear from our esteemed panelists as we delve into these critical issues. Justice Nathalie Desrosiers is a judge of the Superior Court of Justice of Ontario in Toronto and former principal of Massey College. She has held numerous distinguished roles, including Dean of Law at the University of Ottawa, General Counsel of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and President of the Law Commission of Canada. A committed advocate for social justice and civil liberties, she has advanced Francophone minority rights and co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Canadian Constitutional Law. Justice Desrosiers is a member of the Order of Canada, the Order of Ontario, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Her impactful career spans academia, law, and politics, where she represented Ottawa-Vanier in the Ontario legislature and served as a provincial minister. Paul Gooch became a senior fellow of Massey College when he was acting dean of SGS in 1992. He is now in his second term on the governing board. He has been at U of T for 6 decades as a chair, a director, various kinds of dean and vice provost, and then as president of Victoria University. He is now president emeritus and emeritus professor of philosophy. His latest books are Course Correction, with a chapter on university autonomy, and Paul and Religion, Unfinished Conversations. Paul was chair of the Ontario University's Council on Quality Assurance and still teaches in the Vic 1 program in a stream named after him. Cool. Oh. Visiting scholar Jane Toswell teaches Old English, Medieval Studies, Medievalism, and Speculative Fiction in the Department of English and Writing Studies at the University of Western Ontario. As a researcher, she is something of a magpie, having recently published major studies of Longfellow's medievalism, the role of women in the rediscovery of Old English texts in the Victorian era in England, vernacular psalters in early medieval Britain, Jorge, I hope I'm saying that right. Yeah. Amazing. Louis Borges and the medieval university as it survives in the modern university. Her current research projects include a book on medievalism in English Canada and a book on navigating the Canadian university system. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists. Now, to set the stage for our discussion, let's first explore the historical and conceptual roots of university autonomy. Understanding how this principle has evolved over time will provide crucial context for addressing contemporary challenges and strategies. And Jane, I'd like to start with you to help start our conversation here. And could you please elaborate on the historical roots of university autonomy, tracing its evolution from its medieval origins into the present day?
Sure. I have to admit this is a very kind of sordid tale and a little bit pragmatic, which you will see almost immediately. It really starts with Barbarossa, King Frederick Barbarossa in 1155, who as part of a power grab in the Lombardy provinces offered Bologna, which has some credit, as you know, as being the first university, extra privileges. And noted what he specifically offered was that they would have a kind of privilegium scholarium. So they would get the privileges basically of being a cleric, and they were extending the privileges of being clerics to the privileges of scholars, which was really handy because it got them out of having to answer in the secular courts any of the students at the university. Now, Bologna turned down that offer, but it actually got itself embedded eventually into Justinian's law codes, which were being taught in all the universities. So it sort of sank in as a notion that scholars were going to be separate and special. This became important in 1200 in Paris, When one scholar sent his servant to get more wine, and the owner of the tavern really felt that he should be paid for the last lot of wine before handing out more, which is a strange notion these people have. And anyway, the result was a massive riot, and the students wound up attacking the tavern's people. The provost of Paris wound up charging in with all kinds of men. Various people were killed. And in the end, Philip Augustus, the king of France, immediately offered total extra privileges to the scholars because he recognized that they were an advantage to him in Paris and he wanted them to stay. And they were threatening to leave because it's one of those things that, it's one of the things of the history of universities that always interests me is that the masters, when they found out that the students were under attack, joined in and threatened to strike. So that got them a charter from the king, again establishing their specialness. In 1229, they had another round of this, also over drink in a tavern. I told you it was a sordid story. It really is a sordid story. That time, the scholars were really smart. They got themselves a whole sequence of papal bulls. My personal favorite is the one in which the Pope described the universities as wisdom's special workshop. That goes right back to 1229. Wisdom's special workshop. And that meant that the universities had a complete free rein from both the secular authorities in the town and from the ecclesiastical authorities as established by popes. And it meant that the universities had really a lot of autonomy. They were permitted to set their own statutes, to enforce their own statutes, to judge their own people. They never went to the secular courts. They only went to the ecclesiastical courts, which meant that they weren't ever going to get killed or maimed or all of the kinds of things that can happen in the secular courts. And that really set the base for university autonomy. And the last bit that I will talk about quickly is, it was in Oxford, actually in 1355, the St. Scholastica's Day riots, as a result of another, sad to say, this case not wine but beer, I believe, in the Swindlestock Tavern, caused all kinds of ruckus, 3 days worth of rioting, and the universities appealed both to the king, who was hanging out very close by but chose not to come and intervene, and to the Pope and the bishop, and they actually succeeded in getting so much judgment against the townsfolk that the mayor of Oxford was still paying money on his knees in apology to the universities and to the university in 1825. 470 years worth of penance that the town had to do to the gown. So I guess my point is there's a lot of deep embedded autonomy that was really deeply established. You know, property tax. Universities don't pay a lot of property tax. They have rights of appropriation, which I don't think they use very much in Canada, but it's in some of our acts. And then there's the question of internal discipline. Students, you know, I think this was in the documents for us, the kid throws a frisbee and accidentally hits a fire alarm in a university, they might get thrown out of the residence, but they're sure not going to be charged, right? So there has been a real shifts in that kind of autonomy and how that works, but that's the sort of background. And I'm sorry it's such a sordid tale.
No, thank you so much for providing us with that background. This is very engaging. With that background, actually talking about autonomy, I'd like to also turn to Paul to really talk about not just autonomy, but its connection to academic freedom, with both being very vital in ensuring that universities are able to commit to their educational and research missions. How do you see the connection here between autonomy and academic freedom? And can you provide specific or any examples really of how they've been undermined or challenged?
Oh, that's a very big question,
Sorry.
Ikram. But let me start by saying that I think that for me, university autonomy is fundamental for a society that really wants to get at the truth of things. It's the best way to organize the society because, knowledge just happens to be important. And the quest for knowledge is difficult because, partly because it's hard to know things and get it right, and partly because, those in power want to make sure that you believe the things that are going to support them. So to have a place that is independent from the state, from the church, from the synagogue, from all of the interests of society, to have that special place, I think is crucial. And, I think of Massey here. Before we finish, I'd like to talk about the autonomy of Massey College, because, there are walls out there, and there's a gate, and this is a special place. And when you walk into it, you think, well, I have to behave in a certain way. Certain questions are important here, and other questions are not important. In a way, it's a little intimidating because you have to ask yourself, do I belong here? At the same time, when you get inside this place, it's dedicated to understanding, to sharing knowledge, and that I think is a very, very important function for society. So autonomy for me, university autonomy, pertains to the institution itself. And academic freedom is something that the people in the institution, the scholars, have. So the board of a university, I think its responsibility is to guard the autonomy of the institution so that its members can enjoy academic freedom. That's how I see these two put together. But if I may just say one more thing, there's a difference when it comes to adjudicating whether autonomy or academic freedom have been abridged. So if I feel that my academic freedom has been jeopardized or called into question, in most universities, all of them, in Canada, you can lodge a grievance. And you can go to your association or whatever the university has set up. There's a way to settle whether my academic freedom has been infracted. It'll be through peer review rather than from top down. But there is a way to settle that question. Is there a way to settle the question? Has a university's autonomy been intruded upon? I don't know that there is a way to settle that formally. And Natalie, I once had a chat with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court about this, because her point was, when it comes to the independence of the courts, if that's called into question, there's no way to settle that. It has to be society which values the independence of the court, or the independence of the press, or the autonomy of the university. And so, Ikram, my concern about university autonomy is that it can't be safeguarded by legislation very well. It has to be embraced by a society in order to be robust.
And sort of on this topic here of safeguarding, embracing, I'd like to also bring in this legal perspective, Natalie. I'd like to talk about the Charter here. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms safeguards fundamental rights, such as our freedoms of expression, association, equality within Canadian society. In the context of university autonomy, also touching on, Jane, what you were speaking about earlier, the fact that universities do have a significant ability to kind of, you're talking about the example of someone pulling the fire alarm there, of just kind of disciplining and things like that. How does the charter come into play here? How have courts interpreted its application within the university autonomy context, and what are some of the arguments for and against applying it here?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's an evolving question, because let me say that I agree with Paul that a culture of autonomy is what gives you autonomy. It also requires from the own institution the courage to be autonomous, and it also encourages and require a culture of accountability to oneself. So the more autonomy you want, the more you have to have a governance that is embedded in a culture that respects it, that supports it, but also that's not against accountability, that welcomes accountability on its own terms. And I'll come back a little bit on that, because even in the legal context, it becomes important the way in which even the courts will respect that sort of framework. And I also want to respond a little bit to what we've talked about the sordid tale. Well, you should, if you study federalism, you'll see that, there's lots of debates about alcohol in there too. So it's not just the universities who make breakthroughs on the basis of who should regulate alcohol consumption. Just to go back to the question, then, the charter is supposed to apply to government and to legislation. And early on in the charter, the question was, well, what's a government? Is it only the way in which we understand government, or is it a functional analysis? Are there functions that are being done by different institutions that are indeed governmental? And it's an important question, because otherwise the government, to not wanting maybe to be subject to the charter, could delegate a whole bunch of functions that traditionally we expect them to do, so that they would avoid charter infringement. So, for example, we worry maybe about private security guards not having the same responsibility or the same protections that the police officers are subject to. So we should worry a little bit about having a diluted vision of what a governmental function is. Early on, the court said, no, universities are à part. They are not going to be subject to the charter. That was a 1990 decision. But thereafter, there were more decisions that recognized a little bit the danger of creating these charter-free zones around Canada. And so now it's a real issue, because we have the Ontario Court of Appeal, who has decided pretty strongly that universities are not subject to the charter. And the Alberta Court of Appeal has said, no, Alberta universities are subject to the charter in some fashion. So, and people can rationalize it by saying, well, the Alberta institutions may have different legislative requirements and so on. So that's not very convincing if we're going to continue to have a framework of culture that reflects autonomy. There's a scholar that has written a little bit about saying, well, don't dismiss charter application as being anti-autonomy. It could be that the application of the charter would recognize the link that you've expressed between autonomy, institutional autonomy, and freedom of research and freedom of expression and academic freedom. That is, you cannot have academic freedom unless you have a form of institutional autonomy. And the charter is flexible enough to recognize that sort of thing. So it's fun. People that want to continue to research this there's appetite to do so. And these issues are coming particularly to the forefront when they are regulations of protest, and not only, and what happened in the summer, for example, the latest decision from the Superior Court of Ontario although the judge says, I will not decide the question as to whether or not the charter applies, I don't have to, but he has an Appendix A saying, if I'm wrong, and I have to decide, I decide it's not applicable. In any event, if it were applicable, I would say that freedom of expression may have been violated, but as everything in Canada, there's no absolute rights. A proper limit could have been imposed and was imposed. So I think the courts will continue to require university, like no rights is absolute in Canada, but it requires a culture of justification, an ability of governance being accountable, being able to justify why they breached the right. Now, universities are in the business of justification because they have a rich culture of governance. They continue to, and there's multiple ways in which you can debate decisions that are being made. So that guarantee of having a rich culture, a rich governance structure is what will, I think, convince the courts to give lots of leeways and lots of deference to the way in which governments, university may reach a decision. But now the decision is still open, and it'll be nice to, maybe in 5 years, have the same debate.
Right.
Yeah. Having established, I guess, the conceptual historical backgrounds here on our conversation on autonomy, I'd like to now turn to present challenges that are facing universities today. And I'd like to start with a wider question to all of our panelists here on what external challenges we are observing here. What challenges are currently facing and impacting universities? How do these pressures influence autonomy? And can you elaborate on how the roles of these external forces play in shaping institutional self-governance as well? And it's a loaded question, but I think we can start with you, Jane, on just any thoughts you have on these external challenges, and perhaps maybe how we can use history as well to kind of inform how we respond today.
Oh, that's a big one too. I'm going to stick to Ontario universities, and I know you can speak more broadly, but I think when I think about all of the statutes and the acts across the country, I get too confused. So I think one of the external challenges really is the provincial governments, and currently the federal government, which is weighing in all kinds of weird ways. But the provincial governments, all Ontario universities except Queen's, as best I know, have their acts from the provincial government, and they're surprisingly different. You need to read them all quite carefully, because Toronto, for example, has worked out a deal whereby it pays some property tax, but my own university pays nothing. And so that goes back to the medieval sense of autonomy, where basically churches, we have the rights of the clerics. But the provincial government is really intervening in all kinds of odd and unusual ways. The requirement, was it 7 years ago, that we all had to have a freedom of speech statute on our books, or policy on our books, that every university had to sort of huddle together and try to figure out. Actually, we explicitly call it freedom of expression in Canada, not freedom of speech, right? Mm-hmm. And where those limits would be, that became something that we all debated in kind of interesting ways, I think, in the Ontario university system. But that was something that, from my perspective, that was an abridgment of our autonomy. And I see it certainly as affecting, academic free speech, that is kind of embedded into the way in which Canadian universities still function, because it ties together with tenure, and it ties together with the rights of students and faculty to work together to reach conclusions. So I would say the first big actor from the external world is that. A larger question, if I can toss an extra large question in, that you could say is internal as well as external, is the whole question of women. because the moral codes for universities in the Middle Ages were made to try to control men who started university between the ages of 14 and 16. Now, if they were going to do the full run through to a doctorate, that was 16 years. So they wouldn't finish their doctorate till they were close to 30. But when women arrived in universities, actually wearing women's clothes, because I know of a few women who got caught at the universities, and I live in hope that there were lots more who didn't get caught. But other than that, when women arrived in the universities, I think it became very quickly pretty clear that a lot of the moral codes didn't work so well for women. And you can tell, we're still trying to figure out how to handle sexual violence on campus. And in all kinds of ways, we're not doing it very well. So that would be my comments.
Jane, to come back to the provincial government, I think that this is a very interesting set of questions for me, because it goes back to the last century, actually, with the NDP government and Ray Days, if you remember. But successive governments, including, Madam, the Liberals and the Conservatives, have, here's my way of putting it, stuck their nose up to the gate, stuck it through the gate a bit, and we haven't really had that discussion as a university system. I brought a copy of the U of T Act. I could wave it around a bit, but that act gives the governing council the ability to set salaries for the president, for the officers, and for the faculty. The Ray Days took that away. The last government decided that compensation for senior people in the broader public sector had to be capped. Successive governments have had a way of treating the broader public sector as one kind of entity, right? Whereas the community colleges, the colleges are under a different act. Universities have their own charters or acts, but I don't think that our provincial governments have actually respected those acts in a way that I would like to see them do. So for me, the question is, what is the appropriate role of the state in regulating what happens in the university? I mean, the state has never tried to say, well, you can't hire that person or you can't teach that. But it's come up to the edge, I think, a bit. And so it would be good, I think, for board chairs in the province to have this discussion about university autonomy.
Well, actually, I was going to justify my presence on this panel by saying that I've had the opportunity of thinking about this issue from so many different positions. The first time that I really had hard discussions, I was the Dean of Law at University of Ottawa. I was also VP Governance. And at that time, the University of Ottawa has a special responsibility in the statute toward the Francophone, the Franco-Ontarian community, and there was a movement within the university for the university to be subject to La Loi sur les services en français, the French Language Services Act that creates a framework of accountability for French language. So we had deep discussion about whether we should agree to be under an act when indeed, as opposed to creating our own accountability framework around French Services Act, which we ended up doing at the time there. So it was a way of saying we're not against accountability. Right. We set up the accountability framework, and we'll do a sufficiently good job that will push away a little bit from the idea that somebody else should come in. So that was one opportunity I had to. And then, okay, I get elected. And now I'm on the other side because, and at that time I'm a parliamentary secretary for women's issue, and the issue is sexual violence on campus. And what is the appropriate way in which a government who is concerned about sexual violence responds to that? And I think the framework, which was simply, you must have a policy. So again, you know, there was a bit of a tug of war, and I remember these discussions about, should we do anything? Should we not do anything? You know, so I think it's not yes or no, but how, and how much you value the governance structure that exists, how much do you respond. So I think it's still out there as a discussion. And finally, the other part is obviously in a democracy, if there's one dime that is spent on something, there needs to be accountability. So, you know, to the extent that we continue to value public universities, there will be a pressure to say. Now, just before I pass the baton, I just want to give you another way in which I had to discuss this. So I'm the Dean of Law, and I have a colleague who is obviously not happy with some things, which happen sometimes when you're.
I don't think so.
And we had this really interesting discussion about the different ethical framework for colleagues. And the way the discussion was going is that there were 4 types of people in university. First, they were the ones that believed in the ivory tower ethics, okay, which they saw, okay, my accountability is to my peer. It's okay for me to be isolated, to be an ivory tower. My only accountability, my ethical framework is the old way of thinking about that's the best way to achieve good research is to, and the second group was what we called the community, you know, which started by saying, well, it's about access to education. You know, we have to open the doors. We have to be accountable to the larger society. And so that was the second group. And then the third group was the ones that had imagined the university, it's almost chronologically, as being what we called agent of productivity and innovation. So they were seeing the university as training people for the benefit of the economy. They were research for the benefit of innovation. So they saw the university as being an economic agent. So their accountability framework obviously was very different. And the final one, which was the one everyone agreed to and thought was really funny, was now we had created a star system where the academic themselves were becoming influencers and were therefore in a star academy sort of thing, you know. And outside of the laugh that we had, we realized indeed how we all had a different ethical framework, and all people could identify in each one of these and saw the university as accomplishing some goals, and it led to unholy alliances at times where you would have the Star Academy people aligning with the Ivory Tower people because they were both more individually framed as opposed to a community frame. So I just thought, and my point of saying this is, within academia, there is some debate about, and good, rich, that it's a good thing that have different views of the way in which the university should be accountable, and that explains why often the rules of accountability are very low, because you have to satisfy all these people that have very different views. But I thought it was just helpful to realize how much there is diversity in even the ethical comprehension of what a university is.
I actually want to stay on this topic of, looking at this from an internal perspective as well. And I know, Jane, you mentioned internal pressures to my question on external pressures. No, it's perfect because it brings us into this kind of conversation of, well, of course there are external pressures, but how are universities dealing with it, and what internal pressures are they observing? But also, going back to what Natalie was talking about, the different views among people within academia, within the universities, how does that shape these challenges, and how do universities navigate through these differing views as well, even within itself? And I know that Paul and Natalie, both of you have experience in university governance, and Jane, from your experience as well as a professor, I want to kind of talk about this from your perspectives. And so I think, Paul, we can start with you on this kind of conversation of internal dynamics and pressures.
Oh, the internal dynamics, indeed. Well, to Natalie's point, if you're in engineering, you have a very different view of what the role of the university is than if you are in, say, philosophy or in the humanities. So I think the job of the president is try and hold all of this together, which is an impossible job, particularly when there are also donors picking up the telephone and calling you, and alumni and parents, and the government who says that you should tear down the encampment. Spare a moment of charity towards university presidents these days. They're difficult jobs. But internally, I think that it is an issue to get everyone to think about the purpose of the university in the broadest terms, so that we have this conversation about what's appropriate, particularly when it comes to our donors and our alumni, because they have a strong interest in the whatever the university is doing, but their interest may collide with someone else's interests. So I don't know. It's a very difficult question to figure out how to do all of that. But let's recognize that there are these internal and external pressures, not just from government, but from other sources as well.
Well, I come back actually to framing it as accountability to the mission. So if the university decides that indeed it should be accountable to some outcomes of equality, for example, well, if it sets it up in the way in which it respects its own autonomy, then it's not the same as having this being imposed from the outside.
Yeah.
So there's, to me, the more you try to respond in advance to what the demands will be by having a strong culture of accountability, the more you're going to push away against interventions that may be hard-nosed and impose things. So, there's a great saying in law that the more you have more power, the more limits you put on yourself. And I believe that's true for university. The more autonomy they want, the more they have to have a culture of accountability, governance that responds.
Natalie, I think that is the case with the freedom of speech directive that the government gave, because universities had their policies already, right?
True.
So I don't think the world changed very much because of that. But that's to your point, that if you can anticipate the issues and get ahead of them.
Yeah. And you saw in the decision of Justice Kern, he refers to the University of Toronto's policy on freedom of expression and so on. So there is ways in which the other pressures can be responded to when you're indeed having your own accountability. And when you don't have a good system, or if people are not convinced, then there will be pressures for the outsiders to come in.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about, was that if you're going to have an accountability framework, it actually has to involve every element of the university, not just your 4 elements,
No.
but you have to make sure that especially the freedom of expression was a good example, because I think at every university in Ontario, groups were set up to think through the issues, to look at the policies they already have or had, to think through what they wanted to add, what they wanted to subtract, how they wanted to frame the matter. It was students, it was staff, it was faculty. It was a really broad consensus that developed. And I think that follows your point, Natalie, that if you're going to set up internal accountability frameworks, they have to be frameworks that everybody buys into. And that's really hard work, and it takes a lot of talking. But I think it's the most useful work on this kind of front, to build university autonomy by saying, to go back to the encampments, some universities across the country brought in outside forces to close down the encampments very rapidly. Some sort of gradually brought in some outside forces. Some used their own accountability frameworks and internal discipline. And some sort of split the difference and sent half of the encampment people off to some sort of public discipline, and some to private discipline. And I was looking at that and getting questions from all sides, from people on both sides, because I'm in my 9th year on the Board of Governors, as well as all the rest of my sins. And so people sort of think that I understand this stuff, and I clearly don't, given who's sitting beside me. But what they were asking was, well, how come this person got a citing or citation from the local police, and that person got to go to a disciplinary panel? And if you're not absolutely clear on exactly how you're going to handle all of this, that becomes a festering wound. And I think there's a lot of universities across this country that actually now have to figure out how they're going to solve that. If they're going to keep up autonomy.
And the reason why we're having this debate is because it will happen again.
Yeah.
And part of the richness of universities' governance is that they don't all have to do the same thing, and they can learn from each other, and the thinking, our collective thinking about this will continue to evolve, to responding to different pressure. Because that was another part of my life, because at the head of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, I was there during what we called le printemps érable, which was when all the students in Quebec were on strike for a long time, and the different ways in which different universities responded. But also the transformation of freedom of expression. Freedom of expression and the right to protest was imagined a little bit as, okay, you can go down University Avenue, shake your pancarte, shake and then that's the end. If there's 30,000 people, great. If there's only 5 people, then you have not convinced anybody, and so on. Now that, and it started with the Occupy movement, when expression now is to stay somewhere and not move, and the strength of it is not to move, then it requires a new understanding of the limits of freedom of expression and so on. And I think the courts and everybody is struggling a little bit in understanding whether that's a new form of expression, and should it be respected as a form of expression, or is it simply a trespass? So I think it's interesting how movements change and ask different questions, obviously, because their mode of interventions is different.
So I think moving now, the big question is where are we going? What's happening? How do we respond to all these challenges that we've brought forward today? And we're talking about accountability mechanisms, and we're talking about striking the right balance between accountability and academic freedom, and just upholding freedoms of expressions. But how do we do that? What sort of considerations, ethical, practical considerations need to be made? And another question that I have, sorry, too many questions, but also, are there any innovative mechanisms or innovative ways of thinking you've observed from your respective experiences that can help us answer these kinds of questions, or at least have a starting point? And we can start with Paul.
Yes.
Paul, you had your mic up, so.
I'll just point across the Atlantic to the European Universities Association, where they actually have a scorecard for university autonomy. Yeah. Just to refresh my memory. So on 4 points, on institutional autonomy, on financial autonomy, on staffing, and on academic issues such as admitting students, programs, and so on. So they actually score each of the European universities on these in these 4 areas, and every year they produce a report saying whether autonomy, the level of autonomy, is going up or down. Now, there are problems with putting numbers on things, but I think that keeping that consciousness in the public eye. I don't know how many people read the report, but it's there, and I think that would be something that we could consider in Canada or in Ontario, where we would actually try to do some measures of university autonomy and talk about it. Now, university affairs, I think, Jane, you pointed to an article about university autonomy, but what they did was to give some examples, didn't they?
I think so, yeah. And I don't remember them right now.
You don't remember them right now.
Sorry.
So University Affairs, the publication did come out with an article about university autonomy in Canada, but something a little more systematic, I think, it's worth considering. It's worth having the conversation.
Yeah, I think they recognize that it's an issue that requires maybe a bit more thought. My first thought on that is actually going back to what you said, Paul, which is that we actually need to all get behind our presidents to some extent, because they're on the front line trying to mediate amongst all of the pressures that are coming at them from various governments and from other universities. I think sometimes it must be terrifying to decide, okay, I'm going to act on this particular issue first, because you're going to be the first one who's attacked or not attacked, depending how things play out. Because I think if we don't seize our autonomy and make it an issue that we think about every day, I think we're losing it. I think it's disappearing by inches, but it's disappearing.
Well, I think it's important to never lose sight of, the idea that you cannot have autonomy unless you're having a framework of accountability. And because, and part of the accountability can also have the strength of discussions. So we don't want to have autocracy. You would want to continue to have discussions and people being able to disagree, to debate whether or not there is sufficient autonomy or not. I'm all for measurement. I think everything that you measure creates new discussions about how to measure and whether it's real or fake. You don't want just a measurement of autonomy that would reflect institutional dry structure and would not reflect the way in which people behave within the institutions and so on. So I think it's always helpful to measure, because it creates opportunity for deeper and a bit more clarity about what we actually mean when we want to measure. So yes, more accountability is always good.
Thank you very much for all of your insights on that. And we do have some time here to welcome questions from the audience as well, to kind of round out our conversation here. So if anybody does have a question, oh, perfect. We will pass the mic over there. Yeah. I think just for the people online as well, yeah.
Thank you. I'm just listening to, trying to pull all the pieces together, and so it's the intersection between the pieces, so autonomy, but that really needs to come not only from internal but external, so society have to value that. And when I hear that, and then I hear grounding in history and tradition, and then come from groups that historically tradition didn't include. So as female, how do I honor that tradition that kept me out? How do I honor autonomy when historically that internal autonomy have very little accountability to the public need for change? How do we then, as a society, sitting outside of that, support the autonomy and not then try to destroy it because I need in or I need access? So I'm not disagreeing with the history, I'm not disagreeing, but I'm just wondering how these other questions get included, and how do I then support autonomy when currently universities are having the conversation about quality, and underpinning that is that DEI has eroded the quality of universities. So what do we now do with that and that conversation? Even supporting freedom of expression, but so, I just pull those pieces back and to say, how do we maintain the autonomy? How do we ground it in history and not then deal with the negative sides of that pushes people to want to take those things away?
Well, my response was, if you're autonomous, you have to be accountable for your history and for what's going on, and you're not going to be able to prevent people from criticizing, but if you want to maintain a level of autonomy, you have to ground yourself in a strong culture where you're able to respond and engage. So that's would be my. We could look at other institutions that are similarly seen to be institutionally independent for good reasons, the judiciary, the civil service, and they are faced with similar pressures and have to, again, create within themselves a framework to respond to complaint, and so it's an ongoing responsibility of autonomy to finesse and have accountability that's meaningful.
Natalie, I like that. And if I could just bring in the notion of trust.
Yes.
Because I think autonomy, if it's going to be vigorous and respected, the institution has to be trusted. And unfortunately, we're in a time where institutional trust is weakening. So do you think that just the more accountable we are, the better off we'll be? Can we regain that trust? Very hard to know.
Well, there's a famous the decline of trust was the decline of deference, the decline of authority. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that people are not trusting without any questioning. So I think if you move from that questioning being asked is actually a measure of trust, which is I trust that you should deliver and you should continue to deliver. So,
Yeah, if I can toss in, I think EDID is actually a really interesting example to think through some of these issues of autonomy today. Because you're right, it's not something that universities got hold of very quickly. And I'm reminded of the fact that the only scorecard in existence in Canada that's sort of relevant to this is that very right-wing group of academics who say that they're all about freedom of speech, but they're really all about we want to stay white and male and in power.
their speech.
Yeah, it's freedom of their speech. So, but what I find kind of intriguing is that universities have now sort of recognized the importance of those issues, and as the wheel seems to be turning, certainly south of us, I think there's a chance that universities will actually merit the trust that Paul was talking about by holding on to proper policies and accessibility policies and proper EDID policies. I've got a whole pile of books over there about EDI issues in Canada and how they've been hard fought to get there, but to me anyway, it feels like we're getting there in a lot of different universities in all kinds of very different but interesting ways. And the autonomy it is now kind of a ring fence circling around the fact that we need to hold on to these issues as opposed to succumbing to the pressures coming against them. So I think it's a really interesting time to think through those issues, yeah.
No, thank you very much for your question and for your insights as well. It brings me back to my time as a student politician. I was there when a lot of things were happening. Very interesting question and its insights there. I think very important, especially from the student perspective. So thank you for that. And I do want to give our panelists one last chance to kind of give us some final remarks, final words on this topic. I know I just saw your face, Natalie. It's big, but we don't have to solve any major issues today, but just lasting remarks that you'd want to leave in this space and things we should take away and consider. And I think, Natalie, we can actually start with you and then move to Jane and then Paul.
Well, first of all, thank you for thinking of doing this topic. It elicits a lot of good discussion. I think we should continue to reflect on this, continue to discuss and use, and there will be challenges, and there will be new challenges all the time that need to be addressed both outside but also inside. It's very important for us to have big discussions on this. So I welcome and I am very grateful to have been invited.
Well, let me echo that and thank Jane for having the idea in the first place. This is terrific. So the only thing I would add is that Massey, James, may have a role to play in being just a little removed from the universities, so it can comment on universities in a way that any one university might feel it was being presumptive in talking about other universities. So Massey has a role to play, I believe, in thinking about these issues and having...
Melissa Ginsburg, who did the organizing and got the people that I had put number 1 and 2 on my list to come and talk. So I've learned a lot, and I want to thank all of you for coming.
Thank you so much for the idea, Jane, and thank you so much to all of our panelists, Jane, Natalie, Paul, for taking the time to really come here and speak from your perspectives. And honestly, there was a lot to kind of digest there, and it is a very important conversation that I hope continues beyond the walls as well. And thank you to everyone here for coming and attending, and hopefully there have been a lot of points here that you can take with you and kind of let simmer and ensure that this dialogue continues past this space here. So thank you once again to our panelists and to everyone here and to everyone who helped organize the event.